Hey everybody, this is Bo Sanders. I wanted to touch on a couple themes to follow up on the video last week about evangelicals and critical race theory. First of all, I want to thank everybody for the shares, the comments, the views, and the feedback. What an incredible week. I am so grateful that I put that out there and that it got the response that it did. And, it is going to become a bigger and bigger issue. The resistance of evangelicals to addressing issues of critical race and specifically whiteness. And so I feel like this is a live, in the moment, real-time conversation. So there's four themes that I wanted to touch on in way of keeping the conversation going. Conclusions and convictions, individualism, scholarship, and Marxism. Those are going to be our four things today. One of the things that came up is people saying that my assertion that evangelicalism, for whatever it has been historically, has become a set of conclusions. And if you don't arrive at that predetermined destination, those same conclusions, that you're not evangelical. So when issues of belonging are mixed with issues of believing, that has to be addressed. In the believe, behave, belong sequence, that triad, and when you get into issues like in game theory of bounded set, where there are definite boundaries and they are policed, anytime that and my only point here is that anytime your belief is a prerequisite for your belonging, you are not free to do inquiry wherever it leads. And that's what critical theory, and in this case, critical race theory, does. It asks the question behind the question. It examines institutions and organizations and structures, and it wants to know who's at the table, how did they get to the table, is anyone free to get at the table, right? So many things it wants to know. The question behind the question and be free to ask wherever that road may lead. But if belief arriving at predetermined destinations, conclusions, so having convictions isn't wrong, but when it is tied into issues of belonging and membership, then you're not free to do what critical theory is designed to do, its toolkit to do. So the second issue that kept coming up was individualism and just how pervasive it is. It has saturated in the last, let's say, 400 years, every single aspect of evangelicalism. And it leads to some odd manifestations. For instance, in James chapter 1, verse 27, there's this beautiful passage that says, "This is the religion that God finds acceptable." Easy for me to say, right? To take care of widows and orphans in their time of need, and to keep yourself unstained by the world. Inside individualism, though, that becomes a very strange kind of personal holiness. Not a social holiness like some of us would understand it corporately, but an individual holiness and what it leads to is this thing we call double insulation, where not only do I need to protect myself, insulate myself from the polluting influences of the world. We don't smoke, we don't drink, right? That kind of thing. But I also need to guard myself against those who don't guard themselves. So not only do I need to stay away from those polluting influences, but I need to stay away from those who don't stay away from them. And that's how you get silos that form, and how you can get so compartmentalized that you really have not just an echo chamber, but a feedback loop where when there's an outside influence like critical race theory and you're told, don't go over there, just stay away from it, it can really have a powerful effect on you, because not only do you need to protect yourself and keep away from that, but you need to stay away from those who, right, are over there. So that's a really tricky thing to navigate with individualism, especially and I don't want to get in today into consumer capitalism, but it's why evangelicalism is so uniquely coupled with consumer capitalism in the 21st century. Which leads to this third issue of scholarship. In the same vein, if you have to do double insulation, right, then you're not free, especially with the belonging thing that we talked about at the beginning, you're not free to pursue certain types of scholarship. Which is why in moments like this, when large platforms like the Gospel Coalition and Christianity Today want to address this issue, they don't have anyone who employs critical theory, who's an actual practitioner and utilizes it to bring in as a reference. So they have to go to, say, Liberty University and get somebody who specializes in 19th century Russian poetry to speak against critical theory. So anytime you're doing that, or with the Gospel Coalition, got a theoretical chemist, right? Because you're pulling people from different fields to speak against this thing, it actually makes my point that you don't have anyone who does it. Because of the nature of evangelicalism, it's not compatible, right? So even if you could come up with one person who's doing it, that would actually be the exception that proves the rule. This is just not something that evangelicals are free to engage. And that's really going to become an issue as we go forward, which is why I wanted to put out a follow-up video and explain a little bit of my thinking there, is that if you are not a practitioner, if you don't employ this and utilize it, there are all sorts of things, nuance and layers, that would become really vital and maybe even helpful and important. But as an outsider who's speaking against it, you're just warning people away from it, and it lacks any of the subtlety or depth of understanding and engagement. Last issue is Marxism. And just a couple of things I want to say. Number one, you can be in critical theory, specifically critical race theory, without a reference. You don't have to be fluent in Marxist critique and thought. The second thing is, I understand why this boogeyman works. Because when you associate, right, if you have a USA Christianity, then Marxism is communism housed in Russia, who's the enemy. Lenin and Stalin, murders of millions. That's a slippery slope, but it's how you get there. And it's why it's such an effective boogeyman to warn people off from an entire field that has evolved and adapted since 1850s when Marx was writing so much in the last 100 years, but to use this boogeyman. And here's the last thing I'll say. Here's how I know it's a dog whistle, because they don't just do it with Marx. They do it with all of the masters of suspicion. Freud, Darwin, Nietzsche, Marx. What Ricoeur calls the masters of suspicion. They do it with all of them. And so that's a categorical dismissal. To take these really influential 19th century writers, thinkers, and to dismiss them out of hand in order to maintain the established bubble so that you can come to the predetermined conclusions, right? That's a categorical dismissal. If it was Marx alone, I'd say, let's talk about this. But it's actually a technique that gets employed to scare people off, and it's actually really effective. 10 years ago in 2010, I was writing my master thesis at an evangelical seminary on contextual theology. And every time I would encounter the liberation theologies of Central and South America and Marx would come up, I would get physically uncomfortable. I just couldn't conceive of it. I would say, how could you have a Christianity that integrates Marxist critique of capitalism and society? That's like having a Christianity that integrates Satanist insights, right? Like, if that's the enemy, because you have a USA Christianity, you can't see it. And the specter of the Cold War looms large and still scares many people. It's why it's so effectively employed. So those are some follow-ups from the comments and the feedback that I got. I hope that was helpful, and we'll keep the conversation rolling. I think my next video is going to be about this bounded set, center set relational thing from game theory, but how it integrates into the behave, belong, believe triad for evangelicalism and Christianity as a whole. Please let me know any comments, questions, concerns you have, any suggestions for upcoming videos. I am really delighted to be in this conversation and just wanted to say thank you again.